We're going to talk about the gentleman's muscle car, hot rod, whatever you want to call it, the 1970 Toronado GT. The most powerful Oldsmobile up until that point, and actually for many years to come. I'm kind of struggling to think of another 400 horsepower Oldsmobile. I'd be the most powerful ozone of all time, actually, at least from a production standpoint. In any case, the 1970 Toronado GT would be an option package on the last of the first-generation Torados. This generation began in 1966, continued through 1970. Then in 1971, the second-generation Toronado would start, and the car got kind of pudgy and doughy, and it became much larger, as it had to share many more components with the General Motors full-size bodies than this particular Toronado, the first generation, did. Now, while the 1966 Toronado started out with hidden headlamps and this barbell theme where the outer edges as they approached, the fender tops would get wider in section than the midsection. You don't have that here. In fact, you kind of have the inverse on a more massive scale. You've got this power dome that really extends almost the entire width of the hood. You got a little catwalk area in between the hood and the top of the fenders, that little lowered section and a crease down the middle. You also have exposed headlamps for the first time on the Toronado. The Toronado would introduce hidden headlights to Oldsmobile when it debuted in 1966. It would continue to have those in 1967, 68, and 69. Although, interestingly, the 68 and 9 Toronado, the hidden headlamps were activated not by the headlamps themselves moving. They were stationary, but the grills would actually move out of the way on that car. Pretty unique design. Can't think of another car that did that either. Now, as we rotate around to the front three-quarters view, you see a couple distinguishing features of the Toronado GT. The first notable element is the badge up front, just over top of the driver's side headlights. It says Toronado and then GT. Okay, so obviously it's a GT package Toronado. The other thing that you can do to discern the GT is the big stripes that outline the wheel wells. That was something that was exclusive to the GT package. Now, by 1970, I already mentioned some elements of the Toronado design that had changed significantly. It still had these very sharp-bladed fenders, but the wheel arches had evolved significantly and were much more filleted and muted by this particular time frame. You still had the wheel arch that went over top of the wheel, obviously, and the line that kind of surfaced in the crease that went all the way over top of the wheel and then continued down the side of the car, hopped over the rear wheel. But, as I mentioned, the wheel arches were not as well defined. They kind of blended into the main body surface with much more, let's say, gentleness than they did in 1966. I think Oldsmobile was trying to make the car a bit more conventional. Remember that in 1966, the Toronado actually sold well. It sold about 40,000-ish copies. But after that, the sales really tapered off, and it never enjoyed the sales success that I think Oldsmobile had really hoped for it. And as we rotate around to the rear three altar view of this particular car, the other thing that you'll note here is that beginning in 1969, the Toronado on the rear portion got these little winglets or mini fins. And in 1966 and 8, the car didn't have that. It only got that in its final two model years. And I don't know. I think they went with it in 1969 to maybe help with the 1970 front end, or just help the continuity with the front end, because it had this bladed fender up front, and it had a completely different rear profile and feel to it. This kind of ties in with the front a little bit, I would say. You can also see this car as a GT because it has cutouts for the factory dual exhaust out in the back. That was something that came with the GT package. Unfortunately, in 1970, many of these Torados would come with a vinyl roof, and that was something that really became popular after the 1966 model year. I suspect that Oldsmobile division management was really starting to push the vinyl top with dealers, as it was actually a highly profitable option, because when you order a car equipped with vinyl top, the factory did not metal finish the seam between the quarter panel and the roof on the SE pillar. So they had less labor, less leather that was employed when you got the vinyl top. And they did have obviously the expense of putting the top on itself. But in general, it was a very profitable option. And unfortunately, many Torados, I'll say, were afflicted with it in 1967 and later model years. I do have to say, though, that while the styling of the 1966 Tornado is definitely my favorite of the generation, I do like some elements of this one. It's unfortunate it has the vinyl roof, because this would look so much better without it. That a crease that runs the length of the body there, it just looks beautiful. I don't like the wheel arches quite as well as the original Tornado, but you can see how the metallic paint is kind of picking up the light and the highlights that are formed. I especially love the highlight behind the rear wheel and how the sun is kind of gradually picking it up as it goes rearward from the wheel. Just beautiful. And it's again not as good in my eye as the original, but sure isn't bad. And I should point out, we're talking about the Toronado GT and various elements of the option package. This was not a popular option package for 1970, with only about 5,300 of them produced in that model year. So finding one of these Toronado GTs is quite hard, and they're starting to become very collectible. This particular one, which was in good shape, I kind of call it a 3+ on a 1 to 5 scale, a solid driver plus. I went for $40,000 on Bring a Trailer. And that means, mint condition number 1 car or a number 2 car is going to bring potentially even more. So collectors are starting to appreciate them in some cases even more so than the 1966, which doesn't entirely make sense to me. But it's probably because of what is under hood, which we'll talk about more in a second after we describe the interior. Now, while the exterior styling of the 70 Tornado isn't necessarily a letdown, what is for me is the interior. And well, there's a number of reasons associated with that. By this point, General Motors was really trying to save money on some of its interiors. And the original 1966 Tornado lost a little bit over the years with this 1970 variant. The 1967 Tornado interior I actually think was better than the 66 with the buttons and biscuit interior, but by this point looks like it had been kind of tamed and toned down. The other thing is a faux with grain in this 1970 Tornado. No matter which one you have, they always look a little bit Johnnyest, and it just doesn't feel like it fits with the car. It doesn't need some fake wood grain. And the wood grain that Oval used was, I would say, unconvincingly fake. Of course, you have the flat floor up front because this is a front-wheel drive car with no transmission tunnel. The transmission after the torque converter is split. And then there's a Morse hoe chain that's about 2 to 3 in thick. It's a huge thick chain. Then drives the transmission, which is pointing forward in the car, obviously, because it's front-wheel drive, and at least the seats in the 1970 Tornado were halfway decent this kind of vinyl cloth mix, and Olsen went and had the stitching put on the armrest, as well as the center section of the bench seat up front, and it looks halfway decent overall. This car is equipped with power windows, and everything was optional on these cars back in the day, although the GT did get you some optional equipment as standard. And of course, by this point, you do have headrests as well. One of the relative low points of the overall car is the trunk space. And while it looks pretty big in this particular photo, I can tell you from owning a Tornado out of this generation, the trunk isn't horrible, but it's not all that large. It's not very tall. It's decent in terms of depth and width, but you can't really stack much upright. And I would say it's better than the Riviera because the Riviera had the spare tire underneath the load floor. Whereas the Tornado, you can see the spare tires positioned at the front of the trunk. Same with, or I guess I should call it the rear of the trunk. Same with the Eldorado. So you did get a little bit more space on the loading area than you had with the Riviera, but still wasn't all that great. And I think that was one of the downsides of these cars was just the overall smaller amount of space. And perhaps one reason why the car was so much more successful when in the second generation, it went to the full-size body. Those had a huge trunk that you could fill with anything that you wanted, as well as more interior room. And here we get to the really fun area of this 1970 Tornado GT. And that's what's under hood because you have the most powerful ozone engine to date. And like I said, I think the most powerful ozone engine, at least in terms of gross horsepower rating ever, which is this 400 horsepower W34 for 155 cubic inch high compression V8. Wow, that was a mouthful. But you got 25 more gross horsepower than the standard Tornado V8, pretty much through a, let's say, lumpier cam. Although these engines are still quite smooth. They're just not quite as they're not as smooth as the standard variant. But this was a Tornado exclusive engine. an engine that you could not get in any other Oldsmobile. The 400 horsepower was exclusive to Toronado. And unfortunately, there's really nothing under hood that looks all that special. It looks just like a regular old Oldsmobile 455 cubic inch. It would have been nice if they put something like they used in the old days, like Oldsmobile would paint their engines red if they were premium fuel versus black, or they would have the labeling on the air cleaner saying Starfire for, the most powerful engine. But that was all gone by this particular point in time. I suspect they just wanted to use the same air cleaners and the same decals and things on the Toronado, but it is a different engine under hood. Now, interestingly, you didn't have to get the Toronado GT to get the W34 engine. It was optional in any of the Torenados for 1970. So, you just had to get a 1970 Toronado, and you could get a W34 engine, but you didn't get the cutouts in the bumper for the dual exhaust. You didn't get the pin striping that I mentioned around the wheels and some other elements of the Toronado GT package. So, I guess if you're going to opt for it, you might as well opt for the entire thing. Now, in terms of gross horsepower, this was really the year for General Motors and its 400 horsepower variants. Why do I say that? Well, under hood at Cadillac for 1970 in the Eldorado, you got a standard 500 cubic inch V8 making 400 horsepower. There was no option. So you could just get 400 horsepower there in your Eldorado if you wanted. But of course you were paying more than the Toronado if you wanted the Eldorado. And there you have it, the 1970 Toronado GT. Now, one other unfortunate thing about the 1970 Torenados is the colors they were available in. I think the green one was a color called Ming Jade, and this particular yellow, ochreish one might be seeing yellow. Yeah, not necessarily my favorite. The Ming Jade actually I think would be a great color for the car. Son's vinyl roof. Just get rid of that vinyl roof, and the car would look infinitely better in one color, especially with that dipped interior to match the exterior. But the kind of yellow ochre color that you see on the Toronado here, I don't know. But after all, it was the beginning of the 1970s, the decade of excess. And so, if you wanted a car, you had to be seen. And to be seen, I guess you had to get a interesting color. So there you have it. What do you think of the Toronado GT? These are actually appreciating pretty well overall. And I think that the Toronado in general is really starting to find its momentum, particularly the first generation. The second generations haven't been that popular, although they sold well. And I suspect that they will continue not to be all that popular, aside from the 1971 to 72 generation that had the smaller bumpers on the front. But these 66 to 70 Tornados are coming into their own. I think the 66 is the most collectible, probably followed by the 1970 model year. The 1970 GT may even surpass the 1966. And then the other years, the 67 probably comes after that. And then the 68 and 69 will be a tie after that. But they're all great cars. The only thing about the Torenados is the build quality. Amazingly, compared to the full-size Oldsmobiles, wasn't nearly as good. And you could see that in the pictures of the interior that I was showing. Even though that car wasn't a high-mileage car, the interior just didn't look as fresh as it would if it were a full-size Oldsmobile. That was their Achilles heel all the way from the beginning. Even Car Life magazine, when they tested the Toronado in 1966, remarked that parts were falling off and it was a bit of a rattle trap. And it kind of was, if I'm honest, but a rattle trap that looked great with an excellent engine and transmission and generally good reliability overall. Put a comment in the comment section. Let me know what you think. Thanks again for watching.